Now let's work on our auth block. The first thing you should do is head over to your extensions panel and make sure you have the block extension installed. If you don't have it installed, you can just search for block, and it should be the first extension here. Once you install that, let's go back to our file tree, and we can right-click lib, and then select block new block. We're going to call our block auth, and here we see our block is now generated. Let's create a folder called blocks, and add a barrel file, blocks.dart. Let's rename the block folder to auth, and drag this entire folder into blocks. Our barrel file will export auth/authblock.dart. Let's look at the files that our extension generated. We have auth state, which will be the state of our block, auth event, which will contain all the events that we can send to our block, and then auth block, which will take in the events and yield a new state. When creating blocks, I always like to define my state first. So in here, let's remove the abstract from the class and remove class auth initial. We're going to define the variables that our auth state needs. Since auth state will be managing our user's authentication in the app, we need to know which user signed in. So first we'll have final auth.user, user. And in order to import Firebase auth, we can write user, command period, and import Firebase auth. Now that went into auth block, and we can put the prefix as auth, and go back here and type auth.user. The reason the import showed up in auth block instead of auth state is because auth state is part of auth block, so all the imports will be going into auth block. Next, we need to know the status of our auth block, and so these statuses would be unknown, authenticated, and unauthenticated. And based on the current status, we would render a different UI. So let's write auth status, status. And this will be an enum up here, enum auth status, unknown, authenticated, and unauthenticated. Auth state will take in a user, and it will also take in a status. And by default, we'll set the status to auth status.unknown. Our props will pass in user and status, so we're able to compare auth states with each other. And don't forget to add stringify, so when we print out our auth states, we can easily read it. And then we're going to create 3 different factory constructors. The first constructor will be factory auth state.unknown. And this will just return const auth state. And when auth state is created, the auth status is set to unknown. Next, we'll have a factory state for authenticated. And this takes in a required auth user, import meta, and we will return auth state with the passed in user, and the status will be set to auth status dot authenticated. And finally, we have factory auth state dot unauthenticated. That gives us back const auth state status auth status dot unauthenticated. And now we're all done with our auth state. Next, we'll go to the events, and here we can add stringify. The first event we're going to have is something called class auth user changed, and that's going to extend the auth event. This event is going to have auth.user, user, const auth user changed, at required this.user, and the props we can set to user. This event is going to be called whenever Firebase updates the current user that's signed in. And then we have class auth logout requested. Extends auth event. and this event will be sent to the block when the user tries to log out. Now let's head over to our auth block, and here we see we have an error. The method authInitial isn't defined for the type auth block. To fix this, we can do auth state dot unknown, because when our auth block is first instantiated, we don't know the current state of our user. Our auth block is dependent on our auth repository. This is so we're able to access the auth repository methods, such as user and logout. Let's add the dependency. Final auth repository. Auth repository. And inside our constructor, we'll take in the auth repository. And we're making it required because we need to pass it in. And then we'll set our private auth repository to the passed in auth repository. And now that's all good. Let's work on map event to state. We have two different events, auth user changed and auth logout requested. So here we can write if event is auth user changed, then we'll take some action in here. Else if event is auth logout requested, then we want to await auth repository dot logout. And now we're all done with our logout logic. For auth user changed, we're going to put this in a separate function. And to do that, we need to yield star, and this is a generator, map auth user changed to state, where we pass in the event. And this event contains the user. Below this, we can write stream auth state, map auth user changed to state, where we pass an auth user changed event, async star, and then we yield without the star, check if the user is not equal to null, which means that a user is present, so the user is authenticated. We want to return auth state dot authenticated, passing an event dot user. Otherwise, we yield auth state dot unauthenticated, meaning the user is not authenticated. And now we finished our auth user change logic. If we take another look at our events, we know that auth logout requested will be called from the UI when our user taps the logout button. But auth user changed, there's no clear-cut way of doing that from the UI. And so the way we're actually going to call it is by listening to the stream user. And if we hover over user changes again, we can see that this stream is listening for real-time updates whenever the user is updated. So inside our auth block, we can create something called a stream subscription. And the type will be auth user, user subscription. And inside our constructor, we're going to set the user subscription equal to the auth repository dot user, which is our stream, and we're going to listen to it. Listening gives us a user, and if we hover over user, we can see we get the Firebase user. And then we can just add the event auth user changed and pass in our user. And so when our auth block is instantiated, we're going to set our user subscription equal to auth repository.user, which will be updating and giving us back a Firebase user whenever our user logs in or logs out. Once we retrieve that user, we send the event auth user changed with the new user to our auth block. And our auth block then takes in this event, calling map auth user change to state, and then if the user is not null, then we know to yield authenticated with the passed in user. And if Firebase does not have a user, the user here will be null, and so the event.user will be null, and we yield unauthenticated. The reason we don't need to yield any state right here in auth logout requested is because when we call auth repository.logout, this will get triggered and yield null. And so when this is null, auth user change will pass in null, and then here we'll yield the auth state.unauthenticated, and then we'll know to show our login and sign up screen. When the user's authenticated, we know to skip the login and sign up screen. The last thing we need to do inside of our auth block is close our user subscription when the auth block is disposed of from the widget tree. To do that, we can override the close method and write user subscription, put a question mark, dot cancel. And the reason for the question mark is just so if the user subscription is null for whatever reason, we don't end up canceling on null. If we try to call .cancel on null, then the app would crash. So the question mark here is for safety. And now we're all done with our auth block.